Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of history's most misunderstood and frankly maligned figures, the Civil War surgeon. We have this image in our heads, don't we? A grim-faced man in a blood-soaked apron, brandishing a saw like some kind of monster from a nightmare, the butcher of the battlefield. But the reality, as it so often is far more complex, more tragic, and speaks to an incredible level of human grit and ingenuity in the face of truly impossible odds. We're going to explore the world they lived in, a world without our modern certainties, where the enemy wasn't just the soldier on the other side of the field, but the very air they breathed and the dirt under their feet. If you find this kind of deep dive into the past helps you unwind and quiet your mind, maybe consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It's a small thing, but it helps our quiet little community grow. As always, this is a personal request, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And on that note, I'm always curious to see where you're all listening from. It's remarkable to think of us all, scattered across the globe in our own quiet rooms, journeying into the past together. So feel free to leave a comment saying hello and where you're tuning in from. But for now, that's enough of the present. The past is calling. So find your comfortable spot, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and get settled in. Let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to a time of profound struggle and profound courage. Chapter 1. The Sawbones of the Civil War. Let's begin by being fair to them. The men we call sawbones and butchers weren't monsters. In fact, just months before they found themselves standing ankle-deep in blood and mud, most of them were quiet, respected doctors in small towns across America. They were men who, by the standards of 1860, were well educated. They had attended one of the handful of medical schools in the country, where they learned the wisdom of the day. And the wisdom of the day, well, it was a little different from ours. Imagine a doctor's office in, say, 1859. There's no crisp white paper on the examination table. There are no disposable gloves, no hand sanitizer, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. The doctor's most fundamental belief about illness was probably rooted in something called miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread by bad air, a foul-smelling vapor that rose from swamps, filth, and decaying matter. It sounds quaint to us now, but it was the peak of medical science. So a doctor's advice for staying healthy might be to move to a house on a hill with a nice breeze, or to avoid the night air. His primary tools for treating illness were aggressive. The core idea was to restore the body's balance. This usually meant removing something. If you had a fever, the doctor might engage in bloodletting, opening a vein to drain what was believed to be an excess of hot, agitated blood. If you had a stomach ailment, he would prescribe powerful purgatives and emetics, chemicals that would violently empty your system from both ends. Mercury and calomel were favorites. They certainly caused a dramatic reaction in the patient, which was often mistaken for a sign that the treatment was working. In reality, these treatments often just weakened an already sick person, turning a manageable illness into a serious one. This was the doctor who answered the call in 1861. He packed his leather bag with his scalpels, his lancets for bloodletting, and his jars of calomel, and he went to war. He, like everyone else, thought it would be a short, glorious affair, a single decisive battle, a bit of marching, and home by Christmas. No one, least of all the doctors, was prepared for the industrial scale of the carnage that was about to be unleashed. And at the heart of that carnage was a new and terrifying piece of technology. It was small, unassuming, and it would single-handedly define the horror of Civil War medicine. It was called the Minié ball. To understand why the Civil War surgeon's life was such a waking nightmare, you have to understand this bullet. Before the 1860s, armies used smoothbore muskets that fired a round, solid ball. These were inaccurate and had a much lower velocity. A musket ball might break a bone or lodge in the muscle, but it often left a relatively clean wound channel. The Minié ball changed everything. It was a soft, heavy cone of lead, just over half an inch in diameter, with a hollow base. When fired from a rifled musket, the grooves in the barrel gave it a spin, making it incredibly accurate over long distances. But it was the soft lead and the conical shape that made it so devastating upon impact. It wasn't designed to pierce cleanly through a target like a modern bullet. Instead, upon hitting the human body, It flattened and tumbled. It didn't just break a bone, it shattered it into dozens of tiny pieces. Imagine dropping a glass bottle on a concrete floor. That's what a mini-A ball did to a femur, or a humerus. It didn't stop there. As this tumbling, misshapen chunk of lead tore through flesh, it created a massive cavity, pulling with it whatever it touched. Dirty uniform cloth, skin, soil, grass. It acted like a whirling dervish of destruction, eviscerating muscle, shredding nerves and blood vessels, and seeding the entire wound track with the filth of the battlefield. If you were hit in the torso, your chances of survival were almost zero. The internal damage was simply too catastrophic to repair. But if you were hit in a limb, an arm or a leg, you had a chance. A single, terrible, agonizing chance. And that chance was amputation. Now we arrive at the first battle. Let's say it's Antietam, or Shiloh, or Gettysburg. Our quiet town doctor who last month was treating a farmer's gout is now standing in the middle of what can only be described as hell on earth. The sound is the first thing that hits you, a constant, deafening roar of cannon fire, and the high-pitched whistle and crack of thousands of rifles, and beneath it all, the sound of men screaming. The wounded start to pour in, not one or two, but hundreds, then thousands. They are carried, they crawl, they are dragged by their comrades to what is being called a field dressing station. This is usually just a sheltered spot behind the lines, maybe in a ditch, or a small ravine. Here, the surgeon and his assistants, often just musicians or other men deemed unfit for combat, performed the first, most brutal act of battlefield medicine, triage. This wasn't a neatly organized system with clipboards and color-coded tags. Not at first. It was a desperate, split-second calculus of life and death. The surgeon would move through the sea of bleeding, groaning men, his hands and clothes quickly becoming soaked. He had to make an impossible choice with every man he saw. There were three categories. First, the mortally wounded, a man with a gaping hole in his gut, or a shot to the head. There was nothing to be done for him. The surgeon might offer a sip of water, or a word of comfort, or perhaps a dose of morphine if any was available, but he had to move on. To spend time on a hopeless case meant another man, a man who could be saved, would die. It was a terrible, cold logic, but it was the only logic that worked. Second, the lightly wounded, a man with a flesh wound, a graze or a shot that passed cleanly through muscle without hitting a major bone or artery. These men were lucky. Their wounds would be cleaned as best as possible, bandaged with a strip of linen, and they would be sent to the rear. They were the walking wounded. And then there was the third group, the largest and most challenging group, the men with shattered limbs, the men who had been struck by the mini-A ball. These were the men who could be saved, but only through immediate radical surgery. These were the men who would end up on the operating table. Now, when we say operating table, I want you to erase any image you have of a modern surgical suite. There was no sterile room, no gleaming metal, no bright overhead lights. The primary field hospital was whatever sturdy structure could be found near the battlefield. A farmhouse, a church, a large barn. Soldiers would kick down the front door of a family's home, and within minutes the parlour would be transformed. The family dining table, or sometimes just a door ripped from its hinges and laid across two barrels, became the operating table. The floorboards, which a few hours ago were swept clean, were now slick with blood. The surgeon, who has likely been awake for over 24 hours, rolls up his sleeves. His apron is already stiff with the dried blood of other men. He might rinse his hands in a bucket of cold, murky water, the same water he'll use for the next 10 patients. But the concept of sterilizing his instruments is completely alien to him. Germ theory, the idea that invisible microorganisms cause infection, wouldn't be accepted for another 20 years. In his world, cleanliness was about appearances, not about health. He takes his scalpel from his surgical kit, a beautiful but terrifying roll of velvet-lined leather filled with ivory-handled knives, probes and saws. He might wipe the blade on his pants leg before making the first cut. The patient is brought in and laid on the table. He is terrified, in agony, and probably in shock. But he has one small, crucial bit of mercy on his side that soldiers of earlier wars did not: anesthesia. The discovery of the anesthetic properties of ether and chloroform in the 1840s was the single most important medical advance for the Civil War surgeon. The vast majority of amputations during the war were performed on anesthetic patients, The stories of men biting the bullet while a surgeon sawed off their leg are largely a myth, a holdover from the Napoleonic era. But even this mercy was crude. There was no anesthesiologist monitoring vital signs. An assistant, often called the cone man, would take a rag or a sponge, form it into a cone, and pour raw chloroform or ether onto it. He would then hold this cone over the patient's nose and mouth. The goal was to render the patient unconscious, but not to kill him. It was a terrifyingly fine line. Too little, and the man would wake up screaming mid-procedure. Too much, and his breathing would stop, and he would die right there on the table. The assistant had to judge the dosage simply by watching the man's breathing and the dilation of his pupils. Once the patient was under, the surgeon worked with incredible speed. He couldn't afford to be slow. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of men lying outside, waiting their turn. A skilled surgeon could perform an amputation in under 10 minutes. He would first use a scalpel to make circular incisions through the skin and muscle, high above the shattered part of the limb. His assistant would pull the muscle and skin back, exposing the bone. Then came the saw. The sound of a bone saw cutting through a human femur is a sound that, once heard, is never forgotten. It's a deep, wet, grating sound. The surgeon would saw cleanly through the bone. He would then tie off the major arteries with silk thread to stop the bleeding, a delicate and crucial step. He might use a tool to smooth the sawn edge of the bone. Finally, he would pull the flap of skin and muscle back over the stump and stitch it loosely shut, often leaving a drainage hole. The severed limb, the leg, the foot, the arm, was then unceremoniously dropped onto the floor or tossed out a nearby window. Outside the makeshift hospitals at major battles like Gettysburg, piles of amputated limbs would grow, sometimes reaching as high as the windowsills. It's a grotesque image, but for the surgeons, it was simply a byproduct of the work. There was no time for ceremony. The next patient was already being lifted onto the table, and so it went. For hours that stretched into days, the surgeon would work until he was on the verge of collapse. He and his assistants, fueled by coffee and whiskey, would operate through the day and into the night, their work illuminated by flickering lanterns or candles that cast long, dancing shadows on the blood-spattered walls. The air in the room would become thick and foul, a horrifying cocktail of sweat, blood, chloroform and fear. The floor would be covered in a slurry of blood and sawdust, spread to provide some traction. Flies, drawn by the smell, would be a constant buzzing nuisance. This was the reality of the Civil War butcher. He wasn't a sadist. He was a man fighting a desperate war against time and a devastating new weapon. He performed amputations because the alternative was a near-certain agonizing death from infection. That shattered, filth-ridden limb, if left on the body, would inevitably become a breeding ground for gangrene. Amputation was not a choice between having a limb or not having one. It was a choice between losing a limb and losing your life. And in that context, the surgeon saw, as horrifying as it was an instrument of life. The surgeons knew this. They weren't removing limbs, they were removing the wound itself. They were cutting away death to save a life. But even after the surgery, the battle was far from over. In fact, the surgeon's greatest enemy wasn't the Minier ball. It was something he couldn't see, couldn't understand, and had no weapons against. It was the invisible world of bacteria. The second phase of a soldier's ordeal was about to begin, the fight against infection. After the surgery, the soldier was moved from the operating room to a recovery area. This could be the floor of the barn, a bed in the farmhouse, or just a patch of straw in a field. Here, they lay side by side, sometimes hundreds of them, in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The same hands that had just performed an amputation might now change a man's dressing, unknowingly transferring bacteria from one wound to the next. And then, a few days after the operation, the signs would begin. The stump would become red, swollen and hot. The soldier would develop a fever. And then something would happen that, to our modern minds, is utterly bizarre. The wound would begin to ooze a thick, creamy, yellowish-white pus, and the surgeon, upon seeing this, would be pleased. He called it laudable pus, from the Latin laudabilis, meaning praiseworthy. In the medical world of the 1860s, this kind of pus was considered a good sign, a natural part of the healing process. They believed it was the body expelling the bad humours from the wound. Imagine that. Your doctor, looking at a festering, horribly infected wound and saying, "Ah, excellent. Things are proceeding exactly as they should." Of course, we now know that laudable pus is simply the sign of a massive staph infection. It's the debris of a pitched battle between the body's white blood cells and invading bacteria. But for them, its absence was a bad sign. A wound that remained dry and developed a thin, watery discharge was terrifying, because it was often a precursor to the deadliest infections of all. One of the most feared was gangrene. This is when bacteria, particularly Clostridium, thrive in the dead and dying tissue of the wound, producing gas and toxins. The flesh around the wound would begin to die, turning black, swelling up with gas, and emitting a uniquely sweet, rotten smell that once smelled was never forgotten. It would spread rapidly up the limb, and once it entered the bloodstream, it was fatal. Then there was erysipelas, a streptococcal infection they called St. Anthony's fire, which caused a fiery red, advancing rash and a raging fever. And perhaps the most insidious was pyemia, or blood poisoning, where abscesses from the initial wound would travel through the bloodstream, seeding new infections throughout the body, in the lungs, the liver, the brain. It was almost always a death sentence. The surgeon had very few tools to fight these infections. He might try to clean the wound with a bromine or iodine solution. He might apply a poultice of bread or flaxseed to draw out the infection. He would prescribe quinine for the fevers and whiskey, or opium for the pain. But for the most part, he was a helpless spectator. He could only watch as his patient either fought off the infection through the sheer strength of his own immune system, or succumbed to it. For every soldier who died on the battlefield, it's estimated that 2 more died later from disease and infection. The surgeon's true enemy was the hospital ward itself. Amidst this desperation, however, there were glimmers of incredible progress and humanity. The sheer scale of the suffering forced the army to innovate. Before the Civil War, there was no organized system for evacuating the wounded from the battlefield. A man might lie where he fell for days, bleeding out or dying of thirst. A visionary surgeon named Jonathan Letterman, who became the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, changed all that. Letterman created the first dedicated, organized ambulance corps. He established a 3-tiered system. First, stretcher bearers would go out onto the field, even under fire, to collect the wounded and carry them to the field dressing stations. Second, specially designed ambulances, horse-drawn wagons with springs for a smoother ride, would transport the men from the dressing stations to the field hospitals. And third, after initial treatment, men would be moved from the field hospitals to larger, more permanent general hospitals in cities far from the front lines. It sounds so simple, so obvious to us, but in 1862 it was revolutionary. Letterman's system saved countless lives by drastically reducing the time a wounded man spent lying helpless on the field. He professionalized the process of medical care, treating it as a logistical challenge to be solved with efficiency and organization. And it wasn't just men like Letterman. The war also saw the rise of a new force in medicine, female nurses. Before the war, nursing was not considered a respectable profession for women. Hospitals were dirty, dangerous places, but women like Dorothea Dix, who was appointed superintendent of army nurses for the Union, and the legendary Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, refused to be held back by convention. They fought against a deeply skeptical military and medical establishment that believed women were too delicate for the horrors of a military hospital. They proved them wrong. These women organized supplies, cleaned filthy wards, cooked nutritious meals for the men, wrote letters home for illiterate soldiers, and provided a source of comfort and compassion in a world of pain. Clara Barton famously worked on the front lines, bringing her own supplies to the battlefield and tending to the wounded in the thick of the fighting. They were pioneers, demonstrating that compassion and care were just as important to a soldier's recovery as the surgeon's knife. But for the surgeon himself, the war was a relentless crucible. The psychological toll is hard to imagine. Think of the man we started with, the doctor from the small town. In the space of a few months, his world has been turned upside down. His senses are constantly assaulted by the sights, sounds, and smells of mass death. He is forced to perform brutal procedures, one after another, on an endless assembly line of broken young men. He has to make life or death decisions every few minutes. He lives with the constant knowledge that despite his best efforts, many, perhaps most of his patients will die. He suffers from what they called soldier's heart, or nostalgia, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He has nightmares. He develops a tremor in his hands. Many turn to alcohol to numb the horror, to get through another day of sawing and stitching. They were praised as heroes by some, but they were also haunted figures. They had seen the absolute limit of what one human body can do to another, and what one human being can do to try and fix it. When the war finally ended in 1865, these surgeons went home. They packed away their blood-stiffened aprons and their bone saws. They tried to return to their quiet practices, treating colds and setting the occasional broken bone from a fall. But how could they ever be the same? How do you go back to lancing a boil after you've stood at a table for 36 hours straight at Gettysburg, amputating leg after leg while the cannon thunder shook the floor beneath your feet? They brought the lessons of the war back with them. They were, by the end of it, the most experienced trauma surgeons in the world. They had performed more surgeries in 4 years than most doctors would see in a lifetime. This vast, terrible experience did lead to improvements in surgical techniques, in amputation methods, in facial reconstruction. They had learned hard-won lessons about hygiene, ventilation, and the importance of organization. The Civil War, for all its horror, dragged American medicine, kicking and screaming, into a new era. But the myth of the butcher persists. It's easier perhaps to imagine them as unfeeling monsters than to confront the truth that they were ordinary men placed in an extraordinary, impossible situation. They were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century medicine. They fought with the only tools they had, against a tide of suffering so immense it's difficult for us, in our world of sterile hospitals and miracle drugs, to even comprehend. So as you drift off tonight, spare a thought for that surgeon. See him not just with a saw in his hand, but see him by candlelight, his face etched with exhaustion, working desperately to patch together a young man who reminds him of his own son. See him fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the visible wounds of the battlefield and the invisible enemies he could not yet name. He was not a butcher, he was a pioneer, standing at the grim, bloody dawn of modern medicine, doing the best he could in a world that was, for his patients and for him, a very hard place to be. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Floating Prison. Life in Nelson's Navy. Chapter 2. The Floating Prison. Life in Nelson's Navy. And it was a hard place to be, a world of pain and confusion, of trying to outrun an enemy you couldn't see, armed with little more than a knife, a bottle of laudanum, and a bone saw. But as hard as life was for that surgeon, he at least had a bed, a roof that didn't move, and the faint hope of a tomorrow that looked much like today. Let's leave him for a moment, in the flickering candlelight of his field hospital, and journey to a place where tomorrow was a promise, whispered on the wind, a place where the surgeon's table was not a temporary fixture in a commandeered farmhouse, but a permanent, gore-slicked piece of furniture deep in the belly of a wooden beast. Let's trade the mud of the battlefield for the endless heaving expanse of the ocean, and the rifle ball for the splinter. Because for all the horrors of the land, there was another world, a floating world, that operated by its own set of brutal, unforgiving rules. We're going to the great age of sail, to the magnificent, terrifying wooden walls of the British Royal Navy. It's an image we know from paintings and movies, towering masts, clouds of white sail against a brilliant blue sky, the glint of sun on a row of cannons. It's the image of empire, of command, of heroism. But we're not interested in the view from the Admiral's quarterdeck. We're not here for the grand strategy or the geopolitics of the Napoleonic Wars. We're going below deck. We're going to find out what it was like for the average man, the Jack Tar, who made that whole glorious, terrifying machine work. And the first, most pressing question you might have, if you were to find yourself suddenly on the deck of His Majesty's ship Victory around 1805, is, how on earth did I get here? For the overwhelming majority of the nearly 500,000 men who served in the Royal Navy during those wars, the answer was not, I patriotically volunteered to serve king and country. The answer was much, much simpler, and far more grim. The answer was the press gang. Impressment was a practice as old as the Navy itself, a grim necessity, they called it. The Navy always needed more men, or hands, than it could possibly find through volunteers. Life at sea was notoriously hard. The pay was terrible, and often years in arrears, and the chances of coming home in one piece were, to be polite, statistically questionable. So the Navy took its men. The impress service operated on a simple, brutal logic. If you were a male of seafaring age and experience, you were fair game. Imagine you're a merchant sailor. You've just spent 2 years on a grueling voyage to the West Indies. You've survived storms, disease, and the crushing boredom of the long passage. You can smell the land, the coal smoke and mud of London on the air. You can almost taste the first proper ale you're going to have in a warm, dry tavern. Your ship drops anchor in the Thames, and before you can even pack your sea chest, a boat pulls alongside. It's filled with hard-looking men, led by a naval lieutenant. They're armed with cudgels and cutlasses. They're not here to welcome you home. They're here for you. Your captain can't protect you. Your papers mean nothing. The fact that you haven't seen your family in years is irrelevant. You are a skilled seaman, and that makes you a valuable commodity. You protest, you argue, maybe you even fight. It makes no difference. A crack on the head from a cudgel, and you wake up with the worst headache of your life in the stinking hold of a naval tender, a receiving ship. Congratulations, you're in the Navy now. Your 2-year voyage has just been extended indefinitely. You might not see land again, not really, for another 5, 10, maybe 15 years. It was, for all intents and purposes, a state-sanctioned kidnapping. And it wasn't just sailors from incoming merchant ships. The press gangs roamed the streets of every port city. They were the bogeymen of coastal communities, taverns, brothels, boarding houses. Anywhere a seaman might be found was a hunting ground. They would surround a pub, block the exits, and simply take every able-bodied man inside. It didn't matter if you were a fisherman, a ferryman, or a dock worker. If you looked like you knew one end of a rope from the other, you were at risk, and they got desperate. The net was cast wider and wider. Men with no sea experience at all were swept up. These were the landsmen. They might be farmers in town for market day, craftsmen who took a wrong turn, or simply unlucky souls who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine the shock. You're a baker from Sussex, you know yeast and flour, and suddenly you're being told you're a waster on a 74-gun ship of the line, and your job is to haul on ropes you don't understand, and try not to fall off a yardarm 100 feet above a churning sea. It's like being abducted by aliens and told your new job is to recalibrate their warp drive. There were protections in theory. Certain men were exempt. Apprentices, some fishermen, gentlemen. But a press gang in a hurry wasn't too concerned with the fine print, and they operated with a certain brutal creativity. Sometimes they'd board an outward-bound American merchant ship just beyond British waters, and take any sailors they suspected of being British deserters. This little habit, as you can imagine, did not go over well with the Americans, and would eventually become one of the many sparks that lit the fuse of the War of 1812. So you've been pressed. You've been taken from your world and thrown into another. What is this new world? It is, first and foremost, a block of wood. A ship of the line was one of the most complex machines of the pre-industrial age, a floating fortress, a city in miniature, and your new home, prison, and potential tomb all rolled into one. And this city of wood is ruled by a system of discipline so absolute it would make a modern drill sergeant weep with envy. The moment you step on deck, you enter a world governed by the Articles of War and enforced by the boatswain and his mates. The boatswain, or bosun, is a figure of immense importance. He doesn't command the ship, but he and his team of mates are responsible for the physical running of it and for the discipline of the crew. And their primary tool of motivation is a short, knotted piece of rope called a starter. If you're slow to climb the rigging, you feel the bite of a starter on your back. If you're clumsy tying a knot, a starter reminds you to focus. It was casual, everyday violence, designed to turn a confused collection of pressed men, landsmen, and a few volunteers into a cohesive, terrified, and efficient crew. But the starter was just the warm-up act. The main event, the ultimate expression of naval discipline, was the cat o' nine tails. The cat was a whip, but calling it a whip is like calling a shark a fish. It's technically true, but it misses the point entirely. The handle was a thick piece of rope, and from it hung 9 knotted cords of tarred line. It was designed not just to hurt, but to flay, to tear the skin from a man's back. And the reasons for being flogged were extensive: drunkenness, neglect of duty, petty theft, insolence, desertion. The list was long, and the captain's judgment was final. The entire ritual was a piece of brutal theatre, designed to strike fear into the heart of every man watching. It was called flogging round the fleet for the most serious offences, but a more common punishment would happen right on your own ship. The order would be given: all hands to witness punishment. The entire crew, hundreds of men, would assemble on the main deck. The Marines in their red coats would stand guard with bayonets fixed. A wooden grating would be lashed to the rigging. The offender would be brought forward, stripped to the waist, and his wrists tied to the grating. The ship's surgeon would be present, not to prevent the punishment, but to ensure the man didn't die before it was completed. The captain would read the article of war that had been broken. Then he would order the punishment. Boatswain's mate, do your duty. The first mate would step forward with the cat. He would draw his arm back and bring the knotted cords down across the man's back. The sound was a sickening wet slap. 9 lines would appear instantly, turning from white to red. The man would grunt or scream. The boatswain's mate would then carefully run the cords through his fingers, clearing them of blood and flesh, to ensure the next blow was just as effective. After a dozen lashes, the man's back would be a shredded mess. The surgeon might check his pulse. If he was still conscious and strong enough, the punishment would continue. Another boatswain's mate would step forward to ensure the blows were always delivered with full strength. Dozens of lashes could be ordered, 2 dozen, 4 dozen, sometimes hundreds. It was a spectacle of calculated brutality, a reminder to every single man watching: this is what happens when you cross the line. This is the price of disobedience. After the flogging, the man's back would be washed with salt water, not out of cruelty, though it must have felt like it, but as a crude, agonizing antiseptic. Then he'd be sent back to his duties, assuming he could stand. This was the iron framework that held the floating prison together: fear. But life wasn't just moments of stark terror. It was also a relentless, grinding, monotonous routine. The day was divided into watches: 4 hours on, 4 hours off. But 4 hours off is a generous term. It didn't mean you got to sleep or relax. It just meant you weren't actively sailing the ship. During your off-watch hours, you were cleaning, mending sails, splicing ropes, tarring the rigging, or endlessly scrubbing the decks with blocks of sandstone called holy stones. They were called holy stones. The legend goes because you had to get on your knees to use them, as if in prayer. The decks of a naval warship were kept obsessively clean, a constant battle against the dirt and grime of hundreds of men living in a confined space. And that space. Let's talk about the living quarters. If you're picturing cozy wooden bunks, you're in for a rude awakening. There were no bunks. There were no cabins for the common sailor. You lived and slept on the gun deck, the same deck that held the ship's main armament, the massive 32-pounder cannons. Your home was a space about 6 feet wide between 2 of these enormous iron beasts. This was your mess. Here, you and a handful of other men, your messmates, ate your meals at a simple wooden table that would be slung up and stowed away when it was time for action. And where did you sleep? You slept above the guns, in a hammock, a simple strip of canvas, slung from hooks in the deck beams above. Every evening you'd lash up and stow your hammock in netting along the ship's rails, and every night you'd sling it again. You had exactly 14 inches of width to yourself. 14 inches. That's less space than a modern airline seat. Now imagine hundreds of men packed side by side in this swaying, creaking, groaning wooden tube. There was no privacy, ever. You were never more than a few inches from another human being. The smell alone must have been breathtaking. The combined aroma of unwashed bodies, bilge water, tar, stale food, and damp wool. It was a permanent, inescapable feature of your existence. And the sound. The ship was never quiet. It was a living thing, constantly groaning and creaking as its timbers worked against the sea. The wind howled in the rigging, waves crashed against the hull, the officer of the watch shouted orders, the boatswain's pipe trilled. There was no silence. There was no solitude. Let's talk about the food, because an army marches on its stomach, and a navy sails on it. The diet of a sailor in Nelson's navy was functional. It was designed for one purpose, to last for months or even years in wooden barrels without refrigeration. And the star of this culinary show was ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack. Hardtack was essentially a flour and water cracker baked into something with the density of a piece of lumber. It was baked multiple times to remove every last molecule of moisture, making it incredibly resistant to rot. Unfortunately, this also made it incredibly resistant to being eaten. It was so hard you couldn't bite into it. You had to break it up or soak it in your grog or soup to make it even vaguely chewable. But its main feature, the one sailors wrote about endlessly, was the wildlife. The barrels of biscuit were not airtight, and so they became home to a thriving ecosystem of weevils and maggots. Eating your biscuit was a process of tapping it on the table to knock out as many of the little black weevils as you could. In the dark, a common trick was to just eat it without looking. As one sailor wryly put it, "It's better to eat the weevils than have the weevils eat you." To the Navy, this wasn't a sign of spoilage, it was just a source of extra protein. The other pillar of your diet was salted meat, huge chunks of beef or pork, cured in barrels of brine. After months at sea, this meat would become tough, stringy, and so saturated with salt that it was barely edible. It had to be soaked in fresh water for hours before it could be cooked. And even then it was a challenge, and the quality was variable. The contractors who supplied the Navy were famously corrupt. It was not uncommon to open a barrel of salt beef to find it was actually salt horse, or worse, something unidentifiable that had been packed in London years before. To wash this down you had beer or wine, and later, the most famous naval beverage of all, grog. Water on a long voyage would go foul. It would stagnate in the wooden casks, growing algae and slime, so the daily ration was beer. But beer also spoiled. The solution was rum. A daily ration of half a pint of neat rum was given to every sailor. This, as you might imagine, led to a certain amount of drunkenness and disciplinary problems. So in 1740, Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog for the grogram cloak he wore, ordered that the rum be diluted with water, and so grog was born. It was typically mixed at a ratio of 4 parts water to 1 part rum, and served in 2 rations, one at noon and one in the evening. It became the centerpiece of the sailor's day, a brief moment of warmth and cheer in a cold, hard world. It wasn't just a drink, it was medicine, a social lubricant, and a small, reliable comfort. This diet of hardtack, salt meat and grog could keep a man alive, but it couldn't keep him healthy. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables led to the great scourge of the age of sail, scurvy. We know now that scurvy is caused by a simple lack of vitamin C, but they didn't know that then. They knew it was a disease of long voyages. They knew it didn't happen to officers who could afford to bring their own supplies of fresh food. But for the common sailor, it was a terrifying, creeping horror. It would start subtly, a general feeling of weakness, of fatigue. Your joints would begin to ache. Then the most famous symptom would appear. Your gums would begin to swell and turn black. They would become spongy and putrid, and your teeth would loosen in their sockets until they fell out. Old wounds, even ones that had healed years ago, would mysteriously reopen. Your skin would break out in dark, ugly blotches. Your legs would swell. Your breath would become foul, and your mood would sink into a deep, unshakable depression. In the final stages, you would suffer from hemorrhaging, and eventually, death from internal bleeding. It was a slow, agonizing process, and it was terrifying because no one understood it. They blamed it on bad air, on dampness, on laziness. It was a silent, creeping thief that stole the strength from a ship's crew. Man by man, on some long voyages, more than half the crew might be lost to scurvy without a single shot being fired. It killed far, far more sailors than enemy cannon. And it wasn't the only disease that stalked the lower decks. Typhus, known as gaol fever because it thrived in prisons, was rampant. It was spread by body lice, and in the cramped, unhygienic conditions of a man of war, lice were everywhere. It was a brutal, feverish illness that could burn through a crew with terrifying speed. And then there was dysentery, the bloody flux, a product of contaminated food and water that could leave a man weak and dehydrated, often fatally. The lower deck of a warship was a perfect incubator for disease, a floating petri dish, home to hundreds of men with compromised immune systems. The ship's surgeon spent most of his time not dealing with battle wounds, but with the endless, miserable tide of sickness. And yet, despite the brutal discipline, the terrible food, the cramped conditions, and the constant threat of disease, these men were forged into some of the most effective fighting crews the world has ever seen. The whole purpose of this floating world, the reason for its existence, was that moment when the lookout's cry would ring out, "Sail ho!" If the sail belonged to an enemy warship, the ship would explode into a frenzy of controlled, disciplined activity. The order would be given, "Clear for action." This was the moment everything had been building towards. Your mess table would be unslung and passed down into the hold. The flimsy wooden partitions that created the officers' cabins would be knocked down and stowed. The deck would be cleared of anything flammable. Sand would be spread across the planking to provide grip and to soak up the inevitable blood. The livestock, chickens, goats, the captain's cow would be herded down into the hold. Everything that was not essential for fighting was stripped away, transforming the ship from a crowded home into a stark, open killing floor. You and your messmates were also a gun crew. Each of those massive cannons on your deck was manned by a team of 6 to 12 men, each with a specific rehearsed role. You had trained for this endlessly. The process of loading and firing a 32-pounder cannon was a ballet of brutal efficiency. First, the sponger would step forward with a long pole tipped with a sheepskin sponge, swabbing out the inside of the barrel to extinguish any lingering embers from the last shot. An ember left behind could ignite the next powder charge prematurely, with catastrophic results for the crew. Next, the loader would place the gunpowder charge, a cloth bag filled with black powder, into the muzzle. Then came the cannonball itself, a solid iron sphere weighing 32 pounds. The rammer would use another long pole to ram the charge, and the ball all the way to the back of the barrel. Meanwhile, the captain of the gun, the most experienced man on the crew, was aiming. He wasn't just pointing the cannon at the other ship. He was calculating the distance, the speed of his own ship, the speed of the enemy ship, and the roll of the sea. He would use a coin-shaped quoyan, a wooden wedge, to adjust the elevation of the barrel. A small hole at the back of the cannon, the touch hole, was pierced with a sharp spike to open the powder bag inside. A powder monkey, usually a young boy of 10 or 12 chosen for his speed and agility, would run back and forth from the ship's magazine deep in the hold, carrying fresh powder cartridges. They were the only ones allowed to run on deck during a battle. The captain of the gun would prime the touch hole with fine powder. Then he would take the linstock, a slow-burning match on a stick, and apply it. The explosion was deafening, an all-consuming roar that you felt in your bones. The cannon would leap backwards in a violent recoil, stopped only by the thick breaching ropes that held it to the ship's side. The deck would fill with a thick, acrid cloud of sulphurous smoke. For a moment you'd be blind and deaf, your ears ringing, your eyes stinging. Then, as the smoke cleared, the whole process would begin again. Sponge, load, ram, aim, fire. A good crew could get off a round every 90 seconds. Now imagine this, not just from your gun, but from 50 guns on your side of the ship. A broadside. The coordinated firing of every cannon on one side. The ship itself would shudder and heel over from the force. The sound was an apocalypse, a man-made thunderclap that could be heard for miles. And as you're working, you're not alone. The enemy ship is doing the exact same thing. Just a few hundred yards away, you can see the flicker of their gun ports opening, the flash of their cannons firing. You hear a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of silk, the sound of cannonballs ripping through the air towards you. Then comes the impact, a series of deep percussive thuds as the iron balls smash into your own ship's hull. The most terrifying thing in a naval battle was not the cannonball itself. A solid shot might kill a man or two if it hit them directly, but its main purpose was to hole the enemy ship or smash its masts. The real killer was splinters. Your ship is made of oak, thick, seasoned oak. When a 32-pound cannonball travelling at hundreds of miles per hour hits that oak, it doesn't make a neat little hole. It creates an explosion of wooden shrapnel. Thousands of jagged, dagger-like splinters from the size of a toothpick to the size of a spear would fly across the deck at incredible speed. They would rip through flesh and bone indiscriminately. A man could be torn in half, another could lose a limb, another could be peppered with dozens of smaller wounds. More men were killed and maimed by splinters than by cannonballs. You are working your gun, sweat stinging your eyes, your ears numb from the noise. The man next to you, the one you shared your biscuit with this morning, suddenly collapses with a wet cough, a long dark splinter of oak protruding from his chest. There's no time to mourn, no time to help. You have to step over his body and continue the drill. Sponge, load, ram, fire. The deck is slick with blood and sand. The air is so thick with smoke you can barely see the enemy ship. You hear the screams of the wounded, a high, thin sound beneath the roar of the guns. And when you are wounded, not if, but when, you are not taken to a clean, quiet hospital. You are carried down through the decks, past the guns, into the darkest, deepest part of the ship that is still accessible. You are taken to the all-up deck, below the waterline, to a small, cramped space adjacent to the ship's storerooms. You are taken to the cockpit, and here we find our surgeon again, not in a field tent, but in a low-ceilinged, windowless chamber, lit by a few swaying lanterns. The air is thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and fear. The floor is covered with a fresh layer of sand that is already turning a muddy red. This is the surgeon's domain during battle. He isn't wearing a white coat. He's in his shirt sleeves, which are rolled up past his elbows and stained dark. He might be wearing a leather apron, like a butcher, and that's what he has to be. The wounded are laid out on the deck, or on the sea chests of the midshipmen who normally live here. There are dozens of them, a queue of broken men, their groans and cries filling the small space. The surgeon and his assistants, the Loblolly boys, work with a terrifying speed and pragmatism. There is no time for delicate work. The goal is survival, nothing more. A man is brought in with his arm mangled, hanging by a few threads of muscle and sinew. There is no question of setting the bone. The limb is a lost cause. The man is given a large swig of rum, or a leather gag to bite down on. Two of the surgeon's mates hold him down on the table. The surgeon takes his tourniquet, a simple strap of leather, and tightens it high on the man's arm to slow the bleeding. He takes his amputation knife, a short, curved, razor-sharp blade, and in one swift, practiced motion, cuts through the skin and muscle down to the bone. The man on the table screams, a sound that is muffled by the gag and the thunder of the cannons above. The surgeon puts down the knife and picks up the saw. The sound of the saw on bone is unmistakable, a dry, grating noise. In less than a minute, the arm is off. But the work isn't done. The real danger is bleeding to death. The surgeon has to tie off the arteries. He uses a small hook to pull them out from the stump and ties them shut with silk ligatures. Then he takes a hot iron tool, a cauterizer, and sears the smaller vessels closed. The smell of burning flesh fills the air. Finally, he covers the stump with a dressing of tar, a crude but effective sealant, and wraps it in bandages. He moves to the next man, a sailor with a huge splinter buried in his leg. The surgeon probes the wound with his fingers, then with a pair of forceps, he pulls, and the splinter comes out with a sickening sucking sound, followed by a gush of fresh blood. Another man has a gaping wound in his abdomen. The surgeon looks at it for a moment, shakes his head, and gives him a dose of laudanum to ease his passing. He knows a mortal wound when he sees one, and he cannot waste time on a man who will not survive. He has to focus on those he might be able to save. Piles of amputated limbs begin to accumulate in a corner, to be thrown overboard after the battle. The deck becomes so slick with blood that the surgeon and his mates can barely keep their footing, and all the while the battle rages above. The deckhead shudders with the recoil of the guns. A cannonball might smash through the hull nearby, sending a fresh shower of splinters into the already crowded cockpit. The surgeon doesn't flinch. He just keeps working. Sponge, cut, saw, tie, burn. Sponge, cut, saw, tie, burn. A relentless, gruesome production line of human repair. This was the hidden reality beneath the billowing white sails. This was the price paid for those famous naval victories. It was a world of breathtaking hardship, of casual brutality and incredible endurance. It was a world where you could be kidnapped from your home, forced into servitude for years on end, fed food that was barely fit for consumption, and subjected to the constant threat of disease, drowning, and the most terrifying forms of violence imaginable. To survive in Nelson's navy was to be part of a society unlike any other, a society sealed off from the rest of the world, with its own language, its own customs, and its own brutal code. It required a kind of resilience that is difficult for us to even comprehend. When the battle was over, the survivors would wash the blood from the decks, patch the holes in the hull, and bury their friends at sea, sewing them into their own hammocks with the last stitch taken through the nose, a final grim check to make sure the man was truly dead. And then, the routine would begin again. The watches, the holy stones, the grog, the hardtack, sailing on over the endless, indifferent ocean, waiting for the next cry of sail-ho from the masthead. They were not heroes in the way we might think of them. They were survivors, trapped in a floating wooden prison, doing what they had to do to see another sunrise. They were the sinew and bone of a vast war machine, their individual lives a small cheap currency spent to purchase an empire. And their story is a powerful reminder that behind the grand oil paintings of history, behind the celebrated victories and the famous names, there are always the quiet, desperate and astonishingly resilient lives of ordinary people, enduring the unendurable in a world that was, for them, a very hard place to be. Chapter 3. The Dark Satanic Mills. Toiling in the Industrial Revolution. Chapter 3. The Dark Satanic Mills. Toiling in the Industrial Revolution. And it was, for so many, a very hard place to be. But the strange thing about human history is that the hardship rarely ends when the guns fall silent. The great engine of empire, of progress, is a hungry thing. Once it's done consuming soldiers on a battlefield, it simply looks for a new kind of fuel. And as the 18th century bled into the 19th, it found that fuel in the quiet countryside, in the villages and farms that had for 1,000 years moved to the rhythm of the seasons. A new kind of war was beginning, not a war of cannons and cavalry, but a war of steam and iron, of looms and furnaces. It was a war for the future, and its casualties would be the millions of ordinary people whose world was about to be dismantled, thread by thread, and rewoven into something entirely new, and for them entirely terrifying. We leave the blood-soaked fields and the desperate marches behind us now, and we drift into a different kind of struggle, a quieter one, in some ways, but no less profound. We're heading into the age of the machine, the era that gave us so much of our modern world, from the clothes on our backs to the very idea of a 9-to-5 job. Though, as we'll soon see, the concept of 9 to 5 would have sounded like a month-long vacation to the people who built this new world with their bare hands. This is the story of the Industrial Revolution, a name that sounds so grand, so clean, like a chapter in a textbook. But for the people living through it, it wasn't a revolution of ideas discussed in comfortable parlours. It was a revolution of smoke and noise and relentless grinding work. It was the great migration from the green and pleasant land to the city, a place that promised work but so often delivered a very different kind of life. Let's start there, in the countryside. It's easy for us to romanticize it. We picture rolling hills, thatched cottages with roses around the door, a simpler time, and for some, perhaps it was, but for most, it was a life of immense precariousness. You were utterly at the mercy of the weather, the harvest, and the landowner. Life was hard, food could be scarce, and your horizons were often limited to the next village over. Yet, it had a rhythm. You worked under the open sky. You knew the seasons. You were part of a community that had existed for centuries. Then, things began to change. In Britain, a series of laws called the Enclosure Acts began to gobble up the common lands, the shared pastures where a family might graze a cow or a few sheep, the small patch that could make the difference between eating and starving. These lands were fenced off, privatized, turned over to more efficient large-scale farming. Suddenly, families who had lived on and worked the same piece of earth for generations were landless. They were adrift. The old way of life was being systematically dismantled, sold off piece by piece. And just as this happened, a new sound began to echo from the towns and burgeoning cities. It was the sound of machines. The clatter and roar of the textile mill, the hiss of the steam engine, and with that sound came a promise, a siren song of steady work, of wages paid in cash, not in a portion of the harvest. For a family with nothing left, a family whose world had been pulled out from under them, that promise was irresistible. So they packed up the few belongings they had, said goodbye to the only world they had ever known, and walked towards the smoke. They walked towards the future. Imagine arriving in a city like Manchester in, say, 1830. You've come from a world of birdsong, wind in the trees, and the lowing of cattle. The first thing that hits you is the air. It's thick, and it has a taste. It's a cocktail of coal smoke, industrial fumes, and the smell of thousands of people packed into spaces that were never meant to hold them. The sky, which you've known your whole life as a vast, changing canvas of blue and grey, is now a permanent sullen shroud of smoke. The sun is a pale, distant wafer, The second thing you notice is the noise. It's a constant deafening roar that never ever stops. It's the sound of thousands of machines, all running at once. It's the sound of furnaces, of hammers on iron, of steam being released in great shuddering sighs. This noise becomes the soundtrack to your new life. It's the first thing you hear in the morning, and the last thing you hear at night. It seeps into your bones. You and your family find lodging. That's a generous word for it. You're in a tenement, a hastily built brick building thrown up by a speculator with no concern for light or air or sanitation. You might have a single room for your entire family. Maybe it's a cellar, damp and perpetually dark, with water seeping through the walls. There's no running water, of course. That's from a communal pump down the street, a pump that is very likely contaminated with the waste from the overflowing cesspits nearby. Cholera and typhoid aren't abstract medical terms here. They are the neighbours who visit, uninvited every summer. But you're here to work, and the work is in the mill. Let's step inside one of these early textile mills. Forget any modern conception of a factory. This is something else entirely. It's a forest of iron, a maze of belts and pulleys and gears, all spinning and churning, driven by a single colossal steam engine in the basement, the iron heart of this entire operation. The air inside is even worse than the air outside. It's hot, often over 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and thick with cotton dust, a fine white powder that coats everything and everyone. You breathe it in with every gasp, a fine layer of it lining your lungs, a down payment on the bronchitis and tuberculosis that will likely visit you later in life. And the noise. We mentioned the noise outside. Inside, it's a physical assault, the sound of hundreds of power looms, each with a wooden shuttle flying back and forth 60 times a minute, creates a clatter so immense that you cannot speak. You can't even shout. Communication is a series of frantic hand gestures and lip reading. Many workers develop partial or total deafness within a few years. It's a universe of pure, relentless sound. You are given a job. Perhaps you are a weaver, overseeing a few of these clattering looms. Your job is to watch endlessly for a thread to break. When it does, you must dart in, find the two broken ends in the blur of motion, and tie them together with a quick, neat knot. You must do this fast because the machine does not stop. Every second it's idle is a fraction of a penny lost to the owner. The machines themselves are magnificent, in a terrifying way, and they are completely, utterly indifferent to human flesh. In these early days there are no safety guards, no emergency shutoffs. The gears are exposed, the belts are open. If you stumble, if your hair gets caught, if a piece of your clothing snags, the machine will take you. It will pull you in, crush a limb, or worse. Injury is not a risk. It's a statistical certainty. Everyone knows someone who has lost a finger, a hand, an arm. Everyone has seen it happen. The machines are hungry, and sometimes they must be fed. You learn to move around them with a kind of dancer's grace born of pure terror. Your workday begins before sunrise. A bell or a factory whistle shrieks through the dark, cold morning, the signal to rise. You have a few minutes to pull on your clothes, the same ones you wore yesterday, and maybe swallow a piece of bread or some thin gruel. To be late is to be fined, a portion of your already pitiful wages docked. The factory gates are locked precisely at the start time. If you are 1 minute late, you might lose half a day's pay. The concept of a snooze button would have been an unimaginable fantasy. You work for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours. There is no weekend in the way we understand it. You work 6 days a week. The only official break might be 30 minutes for a midday meal, which you eat at your station. Amidst the noise and the dust, the work is monotonous, repetitive, and physically exhausting. You stand on your feet all day. Your body aches, your senses are overwhelmed, but you cannot slow down. Pacing yourself is not an option. Overseeing you is the foreman, or the overlooker. His job is to extract the maximum amount of work from you and your fellow workers. He patrols the floor, watching for any sign of slacking, any moment of rest. He might carry a leather strap, and he is not shy about using it, especially on the children. Ah, the children. We must talk about the children, because a huge portion of the workforce in these early mills was made up of children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old. Their small size and nimble fingers were considered a great asset. They were employed as piecers, the ones who had to dart under the machinery to mend broken threads. or as scavengers, a job that consisted of crawling underneath the giant thundering looms while they were still running to pick up loose scraps of cotton from the floor. The space they had to crawl in was often only a foot or two high. If you were not quick enough, if you raised your head at the wrong moment, the machine would not wait for you. The stories from this period are filled with children maimed, scalped, or killed in this way. These were often parish orphans, pauper apprentices, sold by the church to the factory owners. They were effectively slaves. They lived in squalid dormitories attached to the mill, fed the cheapest food imaginable, and worked the same brutal hours as the adults. They were beaten for falling asleep at their machines, a common occurrence for an exhausted 7-year-old in the 14th hour of their shift. Many grew up deformed, their backs hunched or their legs bowed from standing for so long, or from crawling through the cramped spaces. Their childhood was not just forgotten, it was stolen, fed piece by piece into the relentless machines. For this labour, this 16-hour day of noise, dust and danger, you are paid a wage, but even that wage is not entirely your own. You live in a company town. The tenement you rent belongs to the factory owner. The rent is, of course, deducted directly from your pay. And where do you buy your food, your coal, your candles? At the company store. This system, known as the truck system, was a masterpiece of economic control. The company store often had inflated prices, far higher than you would find in an independent shop, but you had little choice. Sometimes you were paid not in coin of the realm, but in company scrip, a form of private money that was only valid at the company store. You were trapped in a closed loop. The money you earned from the company went straight back to the company for rent and provisions. You were constantly in debt, a debt that bound you to the factory, as surely as any physical chain. Leaving was not an option, because you owed the master. It was a new kind of feudalism, built not on land, but on industry. So you endure. You wake in the dark, walk through the polluted streets to the roaring mill, work until your body is numb, and walk home in the dark to your crowded, damp room. You eat, you sleep for a few precious hours, and you do it all again. The days blend into one another, a long grey smear of exhaustion. This isn't living, it is a state of perpetual survival. It's the sheer grit of the human spirit on display. The simple, profound act of continuing to exist in a world that seems designed to grind you down. And what if you weren't in a textile mill? What if you worked in a different part of this new industrial world? Let's say, for the sake of variety, you were sent not to the mill but to the mine. We must go deeper now, down into the earth. If the textile mill was a loud, hot, chaotic hell, the coal mine was a quiet, cold and claustrophobic one. Before the invention of safety cages, you descended into the darkness in a large iron bucket, or simply by clinging to a chain, lowered by a winch. The journey down is a journey into another world. The light from above shrinks to a tiny star, and then vanishes. You are plunged into an absolute, profound blackness that your eyes will never adjust to. It's a physical presence, a heavy blanket of nothing. The air grows cooler, damper. The only sound is the drip of water and the creak of the winch. You land at the bottom. The only light comes from the candle stuck to your hat, or the small flickering flame of an early oil lamp. These open flames are your only guide in a world of explosive gas, but we'll get to that. The tunnels are not the tall, vaulted passages you might imagine. They are often only 3 or 4 feet high. You cannot stand up. You spend your entire workday crouched or crawling on your hands and knees. Your back is in a permanent, agonizing curve. If you are a hewer, your job is at the coal face. You lie on your side in a cramped space, often in pools of freezing water, and with a pickaxe, you chip away at the coal seam for hours on end. The sound of the pick is swallowed by the immense silence of the earth. Every swing of the axe sends a jarring shock through your arms and shoulders. The air is thick with coal dust, a black powder far more insidious than the white dust of the cotton mill. It clogs your lungs, turning them from pink to grey, and eventually to black. Black lung is the inevitable price of this work, a slow, suffocating death that would claim you years later, long after you were too weak to work in the mine. But the work isn't just for men. Just as in the mills, women and children are a vital part of the workforce here in the dark. Young children, some as young as 5, worked as trappers. Their job was to sit alone in the pitch blackness for 12 hours a day, next to a ventilation door. When they heard a coal cart coming, Their job was to pull the door open, let it pass, and then close it again. That's it. Sit in the dark, in the cold, utterly alone, waiting. The psychological toll of that kind of sensory deprivation on a small child is hard to even fathom. They were the lonely ghosts of the mine. Older children and women worked as hurriers. Their job was to transport the coal from the coalface to the main shaft. How? By strapping a harness and chain around their waist, attaching it to a heavy cart full of coal, and then crawling on all fours through the low, narrow tunnels, dragging it behind them. The chain would pass between their legs, rubbing the skin raw. They were beasts of burden, human ponies, straining in the dark, their muscles screaming, for a wage that barely kept them alive. The images that have survived from this era, the official parliamentary reports with their stark, horrifying woodcut illustrations of half-naked women and children crawling in the dark, are a testament to a level of exploitation that is difficult to comprehend. And all of this work was done under the constant looming threat of instant, violent death. The mines were full of gas. Methane, which the miners called fire damp, was odourless, colourless and highly explosive. A pocket of it, ignited by a miner's open-flame candle, would create a massive fireball, a roaring inferno that would rip through the tunnels, incinerating everything and everyone in its path. Then there was choke damp, carbon dioxide, which would silently suffocate you. And of course there was the ever-present danger of a cave-in, the roof supports giving way, burying dozens of men, women and children under thousands of tons of rock and earth. To survive in this environment was an achievement. To do it day after day, year after year, was an act of almost superhuman endurance. Your body was broken, your lungs were ruined, you lived in a world of darkness and pain. And for what? For a few shillings a week, most of which went straight back to the mine owner for your squalid hut and the overpriced food at his store. It was the same trap as the mill town, just 1,000 feet deeper in the earth. This was the engine of progress. This was the human cost of the cheap coal that fueled the steam engines, of the cheap cotton that clothed the world. It was a system built on the principle that the lives of the poor were a disposable commodity, an endlessly renewable resource to be used up and thrown away. The great inventors we read about, the Arkwrights, the Watts, the Stephensons, they were geniuses, no doubt, but their brilliant machines were operated by a ghost army of broken men, exhausted women, and stolen childhoods. The world they created was one of stark, shocking contrasts. While the factory owners and the new industrial barons built colossal mansions in the countryside, far from the smoke of the cities they had created, their workers lived in conditions that were, by any objective measure, worse than those of many slaves in the American South. The new wealth of the nation was being generated, but it was flowing in only one direction, up. The people at the bottom, the people doing the actual work, saw almost none of it. They were simply the cogs in the machine, easily replaced when they broke down. You might wonder, listening to this, how could people tolerate it? Why didn't they rise up? And the answer is, they did. It was just a slow, painful, and often brutally suppressed process. In the early days, the resistance was desperate and disorganized. The most famous were the Luddites. We use that term today to describe someone who is afraid of new technology, but that's a gross oversimplification. The Luddites weren't afraid of machines. They were weavers and textile artisans whose entire way of life, a skilled craft passed down through generations, was being destroyed by the new automated looms that could be operated by an unskilled child. They weren't fighting technology. They were fighting for their livelihoods, for their communities, for a world where a man's skill had value. They saw these new machines not as progress, but as a weapon aimed directly at their hearts, and so they fought back in the only way they could, by smashing the machines. For a brief period, they waged a guerrilla war in the industrial heartlands of England, a secret army with its own mythical leader, General Ludd. The government's response was swift and brutal. Machine breaking was made a capital offence. Thousands of troops were sent to occupy the region. More troops, in fact, than were fighting Napoleon in Spain at the time. To the British government, a broken loom was a greater threat than the French army. As the years went on, the resistance began to organise. Workers started to realise that their only power was in collective action. The first trade unions were formed, often in secret, meeting in the back rooms of pubs. They were illegal combinations, conspiracies in the eyes of the law. Their demands were, To our modern ears, shockingly modest. A 10-hour workday, an end to the truck system, some basic safety measures, a fair wage paid in actual money. For these simple requests, they were treated as dangerous revolutionaries. Union organizers were arrested, blacklisted, and sometimes transported to penal colonies in Australia. Strikes were met with violence, either from the private armies of the factory owners or from the state itself. The most infamous example in Britain was the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. 60,000 peaceful pro-democracy and anti-poverty protesters, many of them mill workers, gathered in St. Peter's Field in Manchester. The local magistrates panicked and ordered the cavalry to charge the crowd. In the ensuing chaos, hundreds were injured, and 18 people, including a woman and a child, were killed. Their crime was to ask for the right to vote and for bread. The message from the authorities was clear: you have no voice, and your life has no value. But the pressure kept building. Slowly, agonizingly, things began to change. A handful of reformers and compassionate politicians began to speak out. Parliamentary commissions were formed to investigate the conditions in the factories and mines. The testimony they gathered, first-hand accounts from child labourers, from maimed workers, from grieving parents, was so shocking, so utterly damning, that it could not be entirely ignored. The first tentative laws were passed. The Factory Act of 1833, for example, limited the working hours for children. It stipulated that children aged 9 to 13 could not be forced to work more than 9 hours a day, and children under 9 were banned from working in the textile industry altogether. Think about that. This was seen as a great progressive victory. It was now illegal to work a 7-year-old for 16 hours a day. That was the baseline we were starting from. Later acts extended these protections, banning women and young children from working underground in the mines, and eventually establishing the 10-hour day for all. Each of these small victories was fought for, bitterly, inch by inch. They were not given freely. They were won through strikes, through protests, through the tireless work of organizers who risked everything. The comfortable weekend we enjoy, the idea of an 8-hour day, the concept of a workplace that shouldn't kill you. These things were not the inevitable result of progress. They were purchased with the suffering, the struggle, and sometimes the blood of the people we've been talking about tonight. They were the pioneers, not of a new land, but of a new kind of society, one where the worker had at least some basic rights, some claim to dignity. And as you settle in now, as you feel the comfort of your own bed, in a room that is quiet and warm and safe, it's worth remembering that world of noise and darkness, the world where the day was measured not by the sun, but by the factory whistle, where the air itself was a slow poison, and where the machines that wove the cloth and dug the coal were always hungry. The resilience of the human beings who endured that world is staggering. They worked in conditions we can barely imagine, not for fame or glory, but for the simple, desperate goal of seeing the next sunrise, of feeding their children, of holding on to some small scrap of humanity in the face of an industrial storm that was reshaping the world. Their lives were the hidden price of our modernity. Their story is woven into the fabric of the clothes we wear, and buried deep in the earth from which we still draw our power. It's a story that's hard to look at, but one we shouldn't forget. It reminds us that progress is never simple, and its cost is rarely paid by those who benefit from it the most. It's the story of how our world was built, not just with iron and steam, but with the quiet, unyielding strength of ordinary people, toiling in the dark. Chapter 4. Under the Eagle's Shadow. The Grind of the Roman Legionary. Chapter 4. Under the Eagle's Shadow. The Grind of the Roman Legionary. And so we leave the dark satanic mills and the coal-dusted faces of one empire's engine, and we drift back, further back, to the foundational machinery of another. Before the world was powered by steam and steel, it was powered by sinew and bone. Before the relentless churn of the factory, there was the relentless tramp of sandals on stone. We're going to talk about the men who were the gears in the great, terrifyingly efficient machine of Rome, not the senators in their pristine white togas debating in the marble halls, not the emperors whose faces we know from coins and statues. We're going to talk about the quiet, unyielding strength of ordinary people who toiled not in the dark of a mine, but under the often merciless sun of a world being conquered. We're talking about the Roman legionary. When you think of a Roman soldier, you probably picture a man of polished bronze and gleaming steel, a chiseled jaw set in grim determination, standing shoulder to shoulder in an unstoppable tide of red shields. That's the movie poster version. It's the version the Empire itself was very keen on promoting. But like any modern job advertisement, the poster leaves out the day-to-day reality. It conveniently omits the soul-crushing boredom, the endless grinding labor, the chafing, the blisters, the bad food, and the quiet, gnawing certainty that you were an infinitesimally small, utterly expendable part of a project so vast you could never truly comprehend it. So, let's join a young man. Let's call him Gaius. He's maybe 17, living on a small farm somewhere in the Italian countryside. The farm is failing, or his father has too many sons, and Gaius is looking for a way out. He sees the recruiters in the local market town. They paint a beautiful picture, a steady wage, a chance to see the world, the pride of serving the greatest empire in history, and the grand prize, at the very end of this rainbow, a pension, a significant sum of money, or a plot of good farmland to call your own. For a boy like Gaius, who owns nothing but the tunic on his back, this sounds like winning the lottery. It's a career, it's a future, and so he signs up. He takes the sacramentum, the sacred oath. He swears to obey his commanders, to never desert his post, and to put the good of Rome before his own life. He swears it with his hand on the legion's standard, the eagle, the Aquila. It's a solemn, powerful moment. It's also the moment his life ceases to be his own for the next 25 years. 25 years, let that sink in. In an age where life expectancy was, let's politely say, optimistic, a 25-year contract was essentially your entire adult life. He was signing away his youth, his middle age, and whatever might be left after that, for a promise held by an entity so powerful, it might as well have been a god. The first thing that happens is that the army begins the process of systematically erasing the farm boy named Gaius and replacing him with Legionary number 7042. This starts with basic training, a process of brutal, repetitive conditioning designed to break a man's individuality and forge him into a single, unthinking component of a larger weapon. He is handed a practice sword made of wood and a shield made of wicker. Both are deliberately twice the weight of the real thing. The logic is simple and cruel. If you can train for hours with this absurdly heavy gear, the real equipment will feel as light as a feather. His primary training partner is a thick wooden stake, the palace, driven into the ground. For hours every day, Gaius attacks this stake. He learns the brutal efficiency of Roman combat. Forget the swirling, fencing-style sword fights you see in movies. The gladius, the Roman short sword, was not a slashing weapon. It was a tool for stabbing. You get behind your big shield, you lock it with the shields of the men beside you, you create a solid wall of wood and steel, and you jab, you thrust into the soft parts of the body, the stomach, the groin, the throat. It's ugly, intimate, and brutally effective. The centurion, his training officer, barks at him. Don't cut, thrust. A cut might wound a man. A thrust a few inches deep will kill him. And so Gaius stabs the wooden stake, again and again and again, until his arm is a numb, burning extension of the wooden sword. He learns to march. Oh, does he learn to march. This, more than fighting, will be his life. 3 times a month, the recruits are forced on a full day's march, in full armour, carrying their entire pack, first at the regulation pace, then at the quickened pace, covering over 20 miles in just a few hours. This is how the Roman army moved with such terrifying speed. It wasn't magic. It was the result of turning men into tireless engines of locomotion, conditioning their bodies to endure punishment that would break a modern athlete. His feet, unused to the military sandals, the caligae, become a raw landscape of blisters. The centurion doesn't care. Pain is weakness leaving the body. He probably grunts before pointing out that Gaius's tunic is not folded correctly in his pack. And what a pack it is. The gear a legionary carried is the stuff of legend. It wasn't just his weapons and armour. He was expected to be a self-sufficient unit. The Romans had a nickname for the soldiers, after a certain set of reforms made them carry all their own gear, Marius's mules, and they were not exaggerating. Let's do a little inventory of what our friend Gaius is now expected to haul across the known world. First, the things designed to keep him alive in a fight. He has his helmet, the Gallia, a beautiful piece of engineering with its brow guard and neck protector. which also has the unfortunate side effect of turning into a personal oven under the Mediterranean sun. He has his body armor. If he's lucky, it's the iconic lorica segmentata, the overlapping strips of iron. It looks impressive, but it's heavy. It pinches, and the leather straps that hold it together have a nasty habit of rotting and snapping at the worst possible moments. More likely, he wears the lorica hamata, a shirt of chainmail. It's more flexible, but just as heavy, and every single one of its thousands of tiny iron rings is a potential point for rust to begin its insidious work. Then comes the shield, the scutum. This enormous curved rectangular shield is not just a defensive tool, it's a mobile wall. Locked together, these shields create the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, an armoured shell that could shrug off arrows and sling stones. But when you're just marching, it's an awkward 5-kilogram plank of wood and leather that you have to carry. It bangs against your legs, it catches the wind, and it feels like it's actively trying to throw you off balance. He carries his weapons, of course. The gladius on his right hip, easy to draw in a tight formation. The pugio, a dagger, on his left, a last-ditch weapon and all-purpose utility knife. And then there are the javelins, the pella. He carries 2 of them. Each one is a complex weapon, over 6 feet long, with a long, thin iron shank behind the point. They were designed not just to pierce, but to bend on impact, making them impossible to pull out of a shield and throw back. An ingenious piece of battlefield engineering, a miserably awkward thing to carry for 20 miles. But that's just the combat load, that's the easy part. The real burden is the sarcina, the personal pack, which he carries slung over a T-shaped pole on his shoulder. And what's in this pack? Everything he needs to survive, which, according to the Roman army, means everything he needs to be a mobile construction worker. He carries a dolabra, a pickaxe. He carries a shovel. He carries a wicker basket for moving dirt. He carries a saw and an axe head. He also carries 2 heavy, sharpened wooden stakes, called suddards. We'll get to what those are for in a moment. He carries his personal effects, a spare tunic, a woolen cloak that serves as his blanket, a small leather pouch with any personal trinkets he might have. He has a small cooking pot, a cup, and a sickle for foraging. And then, the heaviest part of the entire load, his food rations, 15 days' worth of wheat. Not bread, not flour, just the hard, dried kernels of wheat. Pounds and pounds of it. All told, with his armour, weapons and pack, Gase is carrying somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds of equipment, every day, on every march. Now, picture it. You are Gaius. You wake up before dawn. You strap on this entire mobile existence, and you start to walk. You walk over paved Roman roads if you are very, very lucky. More often, you walk over dirt tracks, through dense forests in Germania where the sun barely touches the ground, or across the scorching rocky deserts of Judea. Your feet, clad in caligae, those heavy leather sandals with iron hobnails hammered into the soles, are your engine. They are brilliant for traction on a battlefield. They are, however, little more than an open framework of leather straps. In the cold, they are a personal invitation to frostbite. In the wet, your feet are permanently damp. On a hot road, the hobnails heat up and feel like you're walking on hot coals. The chafe of the leather straps is a constant nagging source of pain. You walk in a column of thousands of other men, a long, snaking centipede of sweat, dust, and creaking leather. The sound is a constant rhythmic symphony of misery. The clank of metal, the tramp of hobnailed sandals, the grunts of exertion, the low murmur of conversation, and the sharp bark of a centurion telling a man to keep up. The smell is thick and human, unwashed bodies, wool, leather, and the ever-present dust of the road. You march for 5, 6, 7 hours. The T-shaped pole of your sarcina digs a trench into your shoulder muscle. The straps of your armour chafe your skin raw. Sweat runs into your eyes, stinging with salt. Your back screams, your knees ache, your feet are a universe of pain. But you do not stop. You cannot stop. The column is a living thing, and to fall behind is to risk the wrath of the centurion, or worse, to be left behind as prey for any locals who might not be thrilled about your army marching through their lands. Finally, in the late afternoon, the horns blow. The march is over for the day. Can you collapse? Can you rest? No. Now the real work begins. because every single night, without fail, a Roman legion on the march built a fully fortified camp. This was not negotiable. It was the absolute ironclad rule of Roman military procedure, and it's one of the key reasons they were so dominant. They never ever allowed themselves to be caught in the open. The moment they halt, the legionaries transform from soldiers into the most efficient and paranoid construction crew in the ancient world. The standards are planted. The engineers and surveyors quickly mark out the camp's perimeter and its internal grid of streets. It is always the same layout, a perfect rectangle, whether they are in the misty hills of Britannia or the deserts of Africa. Every man knows exactly where his tent goes, where the commander's tent is, where the latrines will be dug. And now you know what the shovel, the pickaxe and the basket were for. Every man is assigned a section of the perimeter. He takes his dolabra and begins to dig. He hacks into the earth, whether it's soft soil or rock-hard clay, and digs a defensive ditch, the fossa. It's usually about 9 feet wide and 7 feet deep. All the earth he excavates is piled on the inside edge of the ditch to create a rampart, the agger. And what goes on top of that rampart? Those 2 heavy wooden stakes, the sods, that he's been lovingly carrying on his shoulder all day. He and his squad mates interlock their stakes to create a viciously sharp palisade wall. In the space of a few hours, an entire fortified town springs up out of nowhere. A town with a ditch, a wall, and a grid of streets. It's an astonishing feat of engineering and discipline. But for Gaius, it is simply the brutal end to an already brutal day. He has marched 20 miles with 80 pounds on his back, and now he has to move several cubic meters of earth by hand. There is no complaining. There is only the rhythmic thud of pickaxes and the scrape of shovels. Only when the camp is secure, when the sentries are posted on the wall, can Gaius finally turn to his own needs. He and the 7 other men in his squad, his contubernium, find their designated spot and pitch their goat-hide tent. This is his home, an 8-man tent that offers basic shelter from the rain and wind, and which smells permanently of damp leather and unwashed men. This is his family now, these 7 other grunts. They are the men he lives with, eats with, marches with, and will likely die with. Now, he can think about food, and what is on the menu? Wheat. Glorious, versatile, and mind-numbingly boring wheat. He takes out his ration of grain. He also takes out another piece of essential equipment, his personal portable millstone, a small, heavy stone device called a quern. He pours the hard kernels of wheat into it and begins to grind, back and forth, turning hard grain into coarse flour. It's another layer of exhausting physical labor at the end of a long day. With his flour, he has a few options. He can mix it with a little water and salt, if he has any, and cook a small, hard, unleavened biscuit over the fire. This is panis militaris, military bread, a tooth-threateningly hard cracker that formed the staple of his diet. Or he could mix the flour with more water and make a kind of porridge, or gruel called pulse. It was warm, it was filling, and it was utterly devoid of anything resembling flavour. If he was lucky, there might be other rations. A little bit of bacon or cured pork for flavour, some hard cheese, maybe a handful of beans or lentils. The army understood nutrition on a basic functional level. They knew the men needed protein and energy, but the concept of food as a source of pleasure or morale was a distant alien luxury. To wash it all down, he has posca. This was the Roman soldier's Gatorade. It was a mixture of water, sour wine, essentially vinegar, and sometimes herbs for flavour. It sounds disgusting to us, but it was actually quite clever. The vinegar acted as a mild antiseptic, killing some of the bacteria in questionable local water sources, making it safer to drink. It was also surprisingly good at quenching thirst. It was not, however, a fine vintage to be savoured by the fire. It was fuel. Everything was fuel. Gaius was a biological engine, and the army provided just enough low-grade fuel to keep him running. And so, as darkness falls, Gaius sits by a small campfire with his squad mates. He gnaws on his hardtack, takes a sip of his sour posca, and tends to his gear. This is a critical ritual. His life depends on his equipment. He has to clean the dust and grime from his armour, check the leather straps, sharpen his gladius, and most importantly, tend to his feet. He examines the blisters, cleans the cuts, and tries to prepare them for the same punishment tomorrow. There's not much conversation. just the low murmur of men too tired to speak much. Maybe they gamble with dice, a favorite legionary pastime. Maybe one of them tells a dirty joke. But mostly they sit in the quiet companionship of shared misery, listening to the sounds of the camp, thousands of men settling down, the distant call of a sentry, the crackle of hundreds of small fires, the howl of a wolf in the dark forest beyond the comforting security of their freshly built wall. This is his life, day after day, week after week, month after month. The scenery might change from the green dampness of Gaul to the dry heat of Spain, but the rhythm remains the same. March, dig, eat, sleep, repeat. The fighting, the glorious battles you read about in the history books, are rare, terrifying interruptions to the unending monotony of the grind. For every 1 day of combat, there are 100 days of marching and digging. The real enemy for Gaius is not the painted barbarian warrior waiting in the woods. It's the sheer soul-crushing boredom. It's the weather. It's the chafing of his own armor. It's the disease that can sweep through a camp and kill more men than any sword. And overseeing this entire brutal ballet is the centurion. The centurion is the backbone of the Roman army. He is a professional soldier, often risen from the ranks. He is not Gaius's friend. He is his commander, his taskmaster, and his judge. He is the man responsible for turning 80 individuals into a cohesive, disciplined fighting unit, the century, and his primary tool for this is fear. The symbol of the centurion's office is the vitis, a short staff made of grapevine wood, and he is not afraid to use it. Discipline in the legion is not a matter of gentle correction. It is swift, brutal, and public. If Gaius falls asleep on guard duty, he will be beaten. If his armor is not properly cleaned, he will be beaten. If he is slow to follow an order, he will be beaten. The vitis is a constant presence, a reminder that the comfort of the individual is utterly meaningless compared to the discipline of the unit. And for more serious offences, the punishments are terrifyingly harsh. If a soldier is caught deserting or shows extreme cowardice in battle, he might face the fustuarium. This is where the condemned man is forced to run between two lines of his own comrades, the men from his own tent, his own century, and they beat and stone him to death. It's a gruesome, intimate form of execution, designed to send a powerful message to everyone else. The unit polices itself. The shame of the one is the responsibility of all, but the most dreaded punishment of all is decimation. It was reserved for units that were guilty of mutiny or mass cowardice. The cohort or legion would be assembled, and 1 man out of every 10 would be chosen by lot, a stone drawn from a bag, a short straw, a simple game of chance to decide who lives and who dies. And then the other 9 men would be forced to beat their randomly selected comrade to death. It is hard to imagine the psychological horror of this. The man you marched with yesterday, the man you shared your food with, you now have to kill, for no other reason than he drew the short straw. Decimation was used rarely, but its legend was a powerful tool. It was the ultimate expression of Roman military philosophy. The individual is nothing. The legion is everything. Your life is not your own. It is a resource owned by Rome to be expended as it sees fit. So why would anyone endure this? For 25 years? Well, there was the pay. A legionary was paid a regular salary. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady. Of course, from this salary, the army deducted the cost of your food, and the cost of your gear, and your contributions to the unit's burial fund. It was not unlike the company store in a 19th century mining town. You were paid, but a good chunk of that pay went right back to your employer. The real money was in conquest. When a campaign was successful, the loot, slaves, precious metals, valuables, was distributed among the soldiers. An exceptionally successful campaign could make a man rich. And there was the donativum, a bonus paid out by a new emperor to secure the army's loyalty. These were the jackpots that kept men marching, the dream of a big score that could make the misery worthwhile. But for most, the dream was simpler. It was about surviving the 25 years. It was about reaching that finish line and claiming the prize, the premia militari, the honourable discharge. Upon discharge, Gaius would be granted a pension, a lump sum of several thousand denarii, enough to buy a small farm or open a shop, or he might be given a plot of land directly, often in a newly settled colony in a conquered territory. Here, the veteran soldiers would form a new community, a little pocket of Roman culture in a foreign land. They were the seeds of Romanization. And if Gaius was not a Roman citizen when he enlisted, if he was a provincial from Gaul or Spain or Thrace who joined the auxiliary forces, he would be granted the most precious gift of all, full Roman citizenship for himself and his descendants. In the Roman world, this was everything. It was a legal status that protected you, that gave you rights, that elevated you from a subject to a member of the ruling class. This was the deal. Give us your body for 25 years of brutal hardship, and if you survive, we will make you one of us. We will make you a Roman. So we imagine our Gaius, now a man in his mid-40s. His face is weathered and leathery from decades under the sun and wind. His body is a roadmap of scars. His knees ache permanently, and his back is a landscape of old pains. He has survived battles in misty German forests, policed dusty streets in Egypt, and built roads over the mountains of Dacia. He has seen things that would break the minds of lesser men. He has lost countless friends to combat, to sickness, to the simple grinding wear and tear of this life. He stands for his final roll call. He receives his discharge papers, his diploma, a bronze tablet proving his service and his rights. He has his pension money in a heavy sack. He is finally a free man. His life is his own again. But is he the same boy who left that farm so long ago? Not even close. He is harder, quieter, and infinitely more tired. Perhaps he takes his money and buys a small plot of land near the frontier where he last served. He marries a local woman he knew during his service. He tries to become a farmer, but the habits of a lifetime are hard to break. He probably still wakes up before dawn, out of instinct. He probably organizes his farm with military precision. He might find the quiet of civilian life unsettling, the lack of a centurion's bark leaving a strange silence in his day. He is a man permanently out of step with the world he fought to create, a tool of war trying to find peace. This was the life of the Roman legionary. It was a life of contradictions. It was a path to upward mobility for the poor, but the price was a near total loss of personal freedom. It was a life of mind-numbing routine, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The legionaries were the men who built the Roman world, not just with their swords, but with their shovels. They were the ones who built the roads, the bridges, the aqueducts, and the forts that stitched the empire together. They were the police force, the construction crew, and the army, all rolled into one. We see the ruins of their work across Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, a straight road cutting across the landscape, the foundations of a wall, the outline of a camp. We see the grandeur of the Colosseum and the Pantheon, and we forget that the wealth that built them was secured and maintained by men like Gaius, toiling under an eagle's shadow in some forgotten corner of the empire. Their individual stories are almost all lost to us. They were the nameless, faceless cogs in the machine, but their collective footsteps echo down to us through history. It is the sound of an empire being built, one weary, painful, disciplined step at a time. The story of the legionary is not one of constant glory. It's a story of endurance, a story of the incredible, almost inhuman resilience of ordinary people, transformed into the instruments of an extraordinary and unforgiving power. It's the story of the grind, the long, slow, relentless grind that laid the very foundations of the world we know. And now, perhaps, as you think of that endless march, that nightly ritual of digging and building, you can let your own day's work fall away and find your own well-deserved rest. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Tyranny of the Pen, a Scribe's Ordeal. And so, as we leave the Roman legionary to their hard-earned rest, a rest earned by moving mountains of earth and marching across continents, we turn our attention to another kind of grind, a different kind of endurance. We're going to trade the clang of the shovel and the tramp of marching feet for a sound far, far quieter, yet in its own way just as relentless, the gentle rhythmic scratch of a feather on a taut animal skin. We are leaving the world of overt physical struggle, the world of muscle and sweat under a punishing sun, and we are stepping inside, into the shadows. We're entering a place where the battles are fought, not with a sword, but with a quill, where the enemy isn't a barbarian horde, but a stray droplet of ink, a moment of lost focus, or the creeping ache that settles deep into the bones after 10 hours hunched in the cold. We are going to explore the quiet, hidden suffering of the medieval scribe, the forgotten labourer whose painstaking work formed the very bedrock of Western civilization. Imagine a room, It's long and narrow, with high arched windows, but don't picture brilliant shafts of sunlight pouring in. The glass, if there is any, is likely thin, wavy, and imperfect. More often, the openings are covered with waxed linen or thinly scraped horn, which cast a pale, watery, anemic light into the space. The walls are thick stone, and they sweat with a perpetual damp chill that seems to cling to your very clothes. This is the scriptorium, the writing room of a monastery, and it is, for all intents and purposes, a factory for producing knowledge, but it's a factory that runs on silence and stillness. The first thing you'd notice upon entering is the cold, a deep, penetrating cold that the thickest woolen robe can't seem to defeat. Fire, you see, was the greatest enemy of a library. An open flame in a room filled with irreplaceable, painstakingly created manuscripts was a risk no one was willing to take. So there is no fireplace here, no cozy hearth. The only warmth is the fading memory of the summer sun, trapped within the stone. In the depths of winter, the scribe's breath would plume in front of them, little ghosts of air in the silent room. Their fingers would grow stiff and blue, their knuckles aching with a cold that felt less like a temperature and more like a physical presence, a malevolent spirit creeping in from the walls. And then there's the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was a mandated, enforced, holy silence. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many of these monastic orders, was very clear on the matter. The scriptorium was a place of work and prayer, and idle chatter was a distraction from God. Communication was done through a series of complex and often slightly absurd hand gestures. A scribe might hold his hand to his mouth and wiggle his fingers to ask for the Book of Psalms, or mime the action of milking a cow to indicate a text by a specific church father whose name sounded vaguely pastoral. It was a silent ballet of devotion and information retrieval, played out in a room where the loudest sound was the whisper of a turning page or a soft involuntary sigh of fatigue. This was the office. No ergonomic chairs, no adjustable height desks, no cheerful chatter by the water cooler. Just a hard wooden bench, a sloping wooden desk, and a profound, bone-deep quiet. And in this chilled, silent theatre for 6 to 8 hours a day, every day, save for Sundays and feast days, a quiet war was waged against ignorance, decay, and the simple, unforgiving passage of time. Now, before our scribe can even think about putting pen to paper, or rather quill to vellum, he needs something to write on. And we, in our world of instant digital documents and cheap, plentiful paper, have forgotten what an incredible, almost alchemical substance a medieval page truly was. The journey of a single page of a manuscript didn't begin in a forest or a factory. It began in a field with a living, breathing animal, usually a sheep, a goat, or a calf. The creation of vellum or parchment was a process that was as laborious as it was, well, let's just politely say it was aromatically challenging. First, the animal had to be slaughtered and skinned. The hide was then washed thoroughly in running water, a cold and unpleasant task to get rid of the worst of the blood and dirt. Then came the part that really tested one's commitment to the craft. The skins were submerged in a large pit or vat filled with a solution of slaked lime and water. This caustic bath would loosen the hair and begin to break down the fatty tissues. For days, sometimes up to a week, the hides would steep in this foul-smelling chemical soup, being stirred periodically with a long pole by a lay brother who surely drew the short straw for that particular chore. The smell of a medieval tannery or parchment-making workshop is something our modern noses are blessedly unequipped to handle. It was a potent combination of rot, chemicals, and wet animal that would have announced its presence from half a mile away. Once the hides were sufficiently softened and the hair was loose, they were pulled from the pit, slimy and heavy, and draped over a curved wooden beam. Now the real physical work began. Using a special two-handled crescent-shaped knife called a lunulum, the parchment maker would scrape away every last trace of hair, fat, and flesh from the skin. It was exhausting, repetitive work. Scrape, turn, scrape, pushing down with all your weight, your muscles screaming in protest, in a damp, stinking workshop. The goal was to get the skin to a uniform thickness, a smooth, pale, almost translucent canvas. But you weren't done yet, not even close. The scraped hide, now called a pelt, was then stretched tightly. It was laced onto a large wooden frame called a hearse, with the laces attached to adjustable pegs. The parchment maker would then go around the frame, tightening each peg, pulling the skin taut as a drumhead. As the skin dried under this immense tension, it would fundamentally realign its collagen fibers, transforming from a soft, pliable hide into a stiff, strong, and incredibly durable writing surface. While it was drying on the frame, the scraping would continue, constantly refining the surface, shaving off any final imperfections with that same curved knife. A slight slip, a moment of inattention, and the knife could slice right through the skin, ruining a large section and wasting all the work that had gone into it. Finally, after weeks of this grueling process, the skin was cut from the frame. The last step was to pounce it, to dust the surface with a fine abrasive powder like pumice or chalk, and rub it vigorously. This created a subtle matte texture, a microscopic tooth that would grip the ink from the quill and prevent it from bleeding. What you were left with was vellum or parchment. The terms were often used interchangeably, though vellum technically referred to the finer stuff made from calf skin. It was creamy, smooth, and shockingly durable. It was a substance that could last for 1,000 years, but it was also a substance that carried the ghost of the animal it came from. Each page was a monument to a life, transformed through a stinking, back-breaking process into a vessel for the word of God, or the knowledge of the ancients. A single large book, like a Bible, might require the skins of over 200 sheep, 200 animals, 200 rounds of that entire filthy process. When you think about that, the idea of a library takes on a whole new weight. It wasn't just a collection of books, it was a silent, patient flock. So now, at last, our scribe has his canvas, but he needs his paint, he needs his ink, and just like the vellum, ink wasn't something you bought in a bottle from a shop. It was something you made from a recipe passed down through generations, a little piece of practical alchemy. The most common type of ink used in the Middle Ages was something called iron gall ink, and its recipe sounds more like a witch's potion than a writing fluid. The key ingredient was something called an oak gall, or an oak apple. These are strange round growths that appear on oak trees. They form when a gall wasp lays its eggs in the tree's bark. The tree, in response to this alien presence, creates a kind of woody, spherical tumour around the larvae. It's the tree's immune response, a botanical scar. These galls are incredibly rich in a chemical called tannic acid. To make the ink, the scribes would collect these oak galls, crush them into a coarse powder, and then steep them in water or wine for several days, creating a sort of weak acidic tea. The liquid would be strained, and then the magic ingredient was added, a substance called vitriol, which is iron sulfate. When the iron sulfate mixed with the tannic acid from the galls, a chemical reaction occurred. A soluble pale solution would, upon contact with air, oxidize and transform into a deep, rich purplish-black pigment that was insoluble in water. It didn't just sit on top of the vellum, it bit into it, chemically bonding with the surface. This is why medieval manuscripts have survived so well. The ink becomes part of the page itself. To finish the recipe, a binder was added, usually gum arabic, which is the hardened sap of the acacia tree. This gave the ink a bit of viscosity, helping it flow smoothly from the quill and giving it a slight gloss when it dried. The final product was a permanent waterproof ink that would darken over time to a rich brownish black. But it had a dark side. It was highly acidic. Over centuries, this ink could literally eat its way through the vellum, leaving behind a ghostly lace of letters, a phantom of a forgotten word. The very substance that preserved the knowledge was also, in its own slow, relentless way, trying to destroy it. And that was just the black ink for the main body of the text. For the illustrations, the famous illuminations that make these manuscripts so breathtaking, an entire palette of colours had to be created, each from its own peculiar source. Red, used for titles and important headings. The origin of our word rubric could come from the mineral cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide, or from a less poisonous source, the crushed bodies of dried insects, like kermes. Blue, the most prized and expensive colour, often came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone that had to be imported all the way from Afghanistan. It would be painstakingly ground into a fine powder and mixed with a binder to create a vibrant celestial ultramarine. Green could be made from malachite or from verdigris, a pigment made by corroding copper plates with vinegar, a process that created a beautiful colour, but also a highly unstable and corrosive one. yellow from arsenic sulfide, known as orpiment, which was also terribly poisonous, white from lead. Gold, of course, was applied as gold leaf, beaten to an impossible thinness and applied with a delicate breath and a steady hand. Each colour was a separate time-consuming process of grinding, mixing and preparing. The scriptorium was not just a writing office, it was a chemistry lab, a pharmacy, and an artist's studio, all rolled into one, and all of it was done with the same quiet, monastic patience, the same methodical devotion. Every stroke of colour you see in an illuminated manuscript represents hours, if not days, of offstage labour, of grinding stones and simmering pots and handling poisons. So our scribe is sitting at his desk. The vellum is prepared, the ink is mixed. Now he needs his tool, not a pen, but a quill, usually made from the primary flight feather of a goose or a swan, as these were the largest and most robust. But preparing the quill was its own art form. The raw feather had to be hardened, usually by curing it in hot sand, which made it less brittle. Then, with a small, very sharp knife, the ancestor of the penknife, the scribe had to cut the tip. This wasn't just a simple snip. The shape of the nib would determine the entire character of the scribe. A broad nib for the bold, formal strokes of a Gothic script, a finer point for smaller, more cursive hands. The nib had to have a tiny slit cut up the middle to act as a reservoir, allowing the ink to flow down to the point through capillary action. And this nib would wear down constantly. Every few pages, sometimes every few paragraphs, the scribe would have to pause, pick up his knife, and recut the point, a tiny, precise piece of sculpture that he had to perform dozens of times a day. A poorly cut quill would blot, or skip, or create fuzzy lines. The quill was an extension of his own hand, and it demanded constant maintenance and attention. With his vellum, his ink, and his newly sharpened quill, he is finally ready to begin. The page in front of him has already been prepared. Using a pointed metal stylus or a piece of lead, he has painstakingly ruled the page with a series of faint, almost invisible lines, creating the grid that will keep his writing perfectly even. It's the medieval equivalent of lined paper, but each line had to be drawn by hand. He dips his quill into the inkwell, a small horn or pot, taking just the right amount. Too little, and the stroke will fail halfway through a letter. Too much, and a catastrophic blot will fall onto the page. He holds his breath for a moment, steadying his hand, and then he begins. The work is slow, methodical. Each letter is a separate, deliberate act. For a formal script like uncial or Gothic textura, each letter was built up from a series of individual strokes called minims: downstroke, lift, crossbar, lift, curve, lift. It was less like writing and more like drawing. He had to maintain a constant angle of the pen, a constant pressure, a constant speed, to ensure that every nuance looked like every other R, every M a perfect reflection of the one before it. The consistency was everything. He wasn't expressing himself. He was acting as a human printing press, a conduit for the sacred text he was copying. Imagine the focus required, the absolute unwavering concentration, the silent room, the cold seeping into his joints, the faint light from the window. The only sounds are the scratch of his own quill and the similar, rhythmic scratching of his brothers around him. He is copying from a master text, the exemplar, which is propped up beside him. His eyes flick back and forth. Exemplar, his page. Exemplar, his page. He cannot misread a word. He cannot skip a line. A common error called homeotelepine, where the eye jumps from a word to a similar word further down the page, omitting the entire passage in between. The physical toll of this work was immense. Let's think about his posture. He's hunched forward, his spine curved into a permanent question mark over his desk. His shoulders are tensed, one arm held tight against his body for stability, the other performing the minute, repetitive motions of writing. For hours, day after day, year after year, scoliosis, chronic back pain, neck strain. These weren't just possibilities, they were the almost inevitable occupational hazards of the job. His non-writing hand would be holding a small knife, not just for sharpening the quill, but for scraping away errors. A tiny slip of the hand, an extra loop on an eye, and he would have to very, very carefully use the tip of the knife to scrape the ink and the top layer of vellum away, then burnish the spot smooth again with a piece of bone or ivory, before he could attempt the letter again. It was a painstaking, nerve-wracking process. A larger error, like a blot of ink, was a disaster. It could mean scraping away a whole word, a whole line, leaving a thin, scarred patch on the page that would never look quite right. A truly catastrophic spill could ruin the entire skin. A week's worth of work, a whole sheep, gone in a single heart-stopping moment. Then there was the strain on his eyes. He is working in low, natural light. Artificial light from candles or oil lamps was greasy, produced soot, and was a fire hazard, so it was used as sparingly as possible. He is squinting at tiny letters, often for hours on end, as the sun moves across the sky and the light in the scriptorium fades to a gloomy twilight. The invention of spectacles was still centuries away for most of our period. Failing eyesight was a death sentence for a scribe's career. He would feel his world literally shrinking, the letters blurring, the lines merging, until he could no longer perform the one task that gave his life meaning and structure. He would be relegated to other, less prestigious work in the monastery, weeding the garden perhaps, or working in the kitchens, all the while knowing that his hands, which once copied the word of God, were no longer steady enough for the task. And beyond the physical pain, there was the mental strain, the sheer soul-crushing monotony of it, copying, letter by letter, a text you may have already copied half a dozen times before. The pressure was enormous. These weren't just books, they were sacred objects. To make an error in a mundane text was bad enough. To make an error in a copy of the Gospels was seen as a kind of spiritual failing, a stain on the soul. The scribe was engaged in a holy act, opus dei, the work of God, and the devil, it was believed, was always watching, always trying to tempt him into a moment of laziness or inattention that would lead to an error. The fight against mistakes was a literal battle against the forces of darkness. We actually have a window into their world, into their minds, through the little notes and complaints they would sometimes scribble in the margins of their manuscripts, far away from the main text. These little bits of marginalia are so wonderfully painfully human. They are the medieval equivalent of a frustrated sigh posted to social media. One scribe, in the margin of a particularly difficult text, wrote simply, "Oh my hand." Another, at the end of a long day's work, scribbled, "As the pilgrim rejoices in seeing his native land, so does the scribe rejoice in seeing the end of a book." They complain about the tools of their trade. "This parchment is hairy," or "A curse on thee, O pen," and they complain quite a lot about the ink. "This ink is bad." The simple four-word cry of frustration that echoes across 8 centuries. They complain about the cold. "The ink freezes," one wrote. Another, in an Irish manuscript, left a little poem in the margin. "My hand is weary with writing. My sharp quill is not steady. My slender-beaked pen juts forth a rash of ink of watery dark colour. I am weary. I am weary. My hand is weary with writing." And they tell us about the sheer physical relief of finishing. The most famous scribal note of all, found in various forms at the end of many manuscripts, reads, "Explicit, Deo gratias." The book is finished. Thanks be to God. You can feel the immense shuddering sigh of relief in those 3 little words. Another put it more poetically. Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back. It dims your sight. It twists your stomach and your sides. This wasn't a job for the impatient. A single, large, illuminated Bible could take a team of scribes and artists years, sometimes more than a decade, to complete. It was a life's work. They would see the seasons change through the watery glass of the scriptorium window. Their life measured out not in days or months, but in quires of vellum, in books of the Bible completed. The sheer, unwavering dedication is almost impossible for us to comprehend. In an age of instant communication and disposable content, the idea of pouring years of your life, your health, your eyesight, into the creation of a single object is almost alien. And what an object it was! The finished manuscript was not just a book, it was a treasure. In a world where perhaps only 1% of the population could read, a book was a symbol of power, of wealth, of divine knowledge. A single Bible could be worth as much as a small farm or a vineyard. Kings and emperors would commission them, trading vast sums for the prestige of owning such an object. They were chained to desks in libraries to prevent theft. They were carried into battle as sacred talismans. They were, in a very real sense, the hard drives of an entire civilization. Everything that was deemed worth saving, theology, philosophy, history, science, poetry, was preserved through this painstaking, painful process of manual replication. Every time a scribe completed a book, he wasn't just finishing a task, he was pushing back against the dark. He was fighting against the natural entropy of the universe, the tendency of all things to decay and be forgotten. He was taking a fragile, ephemeral text and giving it a new body, a new lease on life, ensuring it would survive for another generation, perhaps for another 1,000 years. It was a quiet, anonymous form of heroism. We don't know most of their names. They didn't sign their work, except for the occasional, hidden note in the colophon at the very end. The glory was for God, not for the individual. They were the invisible architects of the intellectual world. Think of it this way. If you've ever had to write a long essay or report, you know the feeling of your hand cramping up, your back starting to ache. Now imagine doing that for 8 hours a day, every day. Imagine you're not writing in your own words, but copying a dense Latin text. Imagine you're not using a smooth-flowing ballpoint pen, but a finicky, temperamental bird feather that needs constant reshaping. Imagine your screen is a piece of animal skin that cost a small fortune and can be ruined by a single thoughtless movement. Imagine there is no delete key, no backspace. Every mistake is a scar that must be physically scraped away from the fabric of the page. And imagine doing all of this in a room that is just a few degrees warmer than a refrigerator, in a silence so profound you can hear the blood pounding in your ears. That was the reality for the medieval scribe. It was a life of profound contradiction. It was an intellectual pursuit that demanded the endurance of a manual laborer. It was a creative act, governed by the strictest rules of conformity. It was a task that produced objects of breathtaking beauty, born from conditions of extreme discomfort and physical pain. It was a silent, stationary life, yet it was one of the most powerful engines of cultural transmission the world has ever known. Without these anonymous, hunched figures, so much would have been lost. The philosophy of Aristotle, the poetry of Virgil, the medical knowledge of Galen, all survived the so-called Dark Ages because someone, somewhere, in a cold, quiet room, thought it was worth saving. They sat, day after day, and copied. They battled the cold, the pain, the boredom, and the ever-present threat of the ink blot. They poured their lives, drop by painful drop, onto the stretched and scraped skin of a dead animal. So as you settle in, as you let the day's own demands and pressures fade away, maybe spare a thought for that scribe. Picture him in the fading light of a winter afternoon. His back is a single, continuous ache. His eyes burn from the strain. His fingers are cramped and stained with ink. He has just finished a page. He lifts his quill, and for a moment he allows himself to look at his work. The lines are straight, the letters are even, and black against the creamy vellum. A single beautifully illuminated capital letter glows with gold and lapis blue in the corner, a little window of heaven on the page. And in that moment, despite the pain and the cold, there is a quiet, profound satisfaction. He has done his work. He has kept the flame of knowledge alive for one more day. And in that quiet, chilly room, in that moment of stillness between one word and the next, there is a kind of peace. A peace born not of comfort, but of purpose. A peace that comes from a long day's work done well in the service of something larger than oneself. It is the peace of the scribe, the silent guardian of the past. And as we leave him to his work, to the gentle rhythmic scratching of his quill, perhaps we can find our own quiet, our own peace, and allow the story of his incredible forgotten labor to guide us gently into rest.